Hey everyone, welcome back to Group 2's channel. And as we said, we're going to start off with the rod bearing job. We got our technician Dax here, getting started on the car. And I got a bunch of parts laid out that are going to be a part of the process as well. Dax has already taken liberty of removing some parts from the car in order to gain more access to the front subframe, which he'll actually be lowering now. Let's take a look at those parts real quick. So here we have our reinforcement plate, as we can see is completely nasty, so we'll have to get that all washed and cleaned up. It also is showing us that we have an oil leak on this car, but that's all right, because since we're doing this job, we are going to take care of oil leaks since we're servicing the whole bottom of the engine. So coming to the bottom side here, Dax has already lowered the sway bar and disconnected a couple bolts, like for all the power steering line here and whatnot. We did have torn steering rack boots, so we're gonna end up replacing those. But this is a good time for us to analyze what is going bad or is bad on the car and replace it now while we're going through this process. So since mostly everything is removed already, Dax is now just having the front subframe that needs to be lowered in order for us to gain access to the oil pan, to drop that, and then replace the rod bearings. While Dax is working on getting that front subframe lowered, let me show you some of the parts that we are going to be replacing. So starting on this end, we have a brand new oil pan gasket, of course, which is always necessary. Brand new bolts for the oil pan, since it is recommended to always replace those bolts, and various different oil seals, like for the dipstick and the center cover on the oil pan. Now, the most important part of this job is the rod bolts and the rod bearings. Why don't we take a look at these? So here we have S54 engines. The early models used 11mm bolts. So for example, in cars and engines from 2001 and 2002. Now in 2003, we had a crossover year where they went to 10mm bolts. They are a little bit different in size, not just in the length. And then of course, what we're actually replacing, the rod bearings. Now there's a bunch of different rod bearings and bolts and whatnot on the market, but specifically for this job, we're gonna be using calico coated rod bearings from BAC Motorsport with ARP rod bolts. And then as I mentioned, this is a great time to replace any other worn or broken components. Like these, for example, are different tensioners and pulleys, and of course doing belts and miscellaneous other seals.
Another important thing to service on this E46 M3 is the cooling system. We are replacing the thermostat, the gaskets, and the hoses. So we are now ready to lower the front subframe because we have removed the 4 subframe bolts, the steering shaft, the 2 engine mounts, and the 4 control arms bolts.
So now that we're at this point, to remove the oil pan, we need to disconnect the oil dipstick tube, the sensor here, and this pickup line, and then all the bolts.
During the process like this, it's always good to replace any gaskets that you can. For example, this one, the one here, and the one for the dipstick.
Now that the oil pan is dropped, we have access to the rod ends, and once we take those caps off, we will see the rod bearings and we'll show you the current condition. This car has 170,000 miles, so let's see how worn they are. In order to gain access to cylinder 1, Dax also removed the oil pump. And now we can see here that each cylinder pairs up. So we'll be able to do 2 rod bearings at the same time. For example, the 2 inners line up, and then it follows outer, and then outer. In other words, 3 and 4, 2 and 5, 1 and 6. The main reason we do this repair and or upgrade is because these engines rev extremely high for a road car, and if you look at the bearings themselves, they're not that big compared to other engines. These little bearings have to take all of that stress. So that's why we opt for something like a WPC or a Calico treated bearing. So as we mentioned earlier, the year of the model is going to dictate what size rod bolts are used on the engine. In this case, it is a 2003, it is a crossover year, but it still uses the M11 bolt with the 12-point head. So normally, if we were going to reuse these bolts, we would simply, as per instructions here, install them in the exact same location. So it's important that you take note of that. They're also only tightened one time, whereas these M10 Torx head bolts are stretch bolts, so you have to buy new ones. In our case, we're going to use our early 11mm ARP rod bolts, which will be torqued to 50 foot-pounds. So now Dax is prepping the rod end surface for the new VAC Motorsport Calico coated bearings. Inserted like so, snap fit, and the final prep stage, adding some assembly lube. And he'll repeat this for every single rod end. So now that the VAC Motorsport rod bearings and the ARP bolts have been installed, all that leaves for us to do is torque them to ARP spec. Now we are going to save that for part 2 because we do want to show you that torquing sequence as well as the reinstallation of the oil pan and the front subframe to complete the job. So stick around for part 2. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video with your friends, and check us out at Group 2 Motorsports and Group 2 Automotive in Woodinville, Washington. And we'll see you on the next video.